Hacienda Buena Vista. I'm not getting any action. Work on a workshop entitled Presentation of the Historical and Cultural Heritage of Slaves and Laborers at Hacienda Buena Vista. For 2 days, we looked into the history and operations of a small coffee estancia built in 1833 in a region in the southern part of Puerto Rico, which also had the highest concentration at that time of slaves. We discussed audiences, we met with local neighbors, and we discussed possible forms for an exhibition. In the end, there was no official presentation in 1993 about slavery. It seems the topic was too enmeshed in the relationship between the island and the United States. And of course, the topic is linked to race. And as one of the participants said, Puerto Ricans do not like to discuss race. At that time of the workshop, I had been working with the Fideicomiso de Conservación de Puerto Rico, which is the Conservation Trust of Puerto Rico, for about a decade. The trust is a nonprofit organization dedicated to preserving land and structures of historical and natural value. A very essential gift to the island of Puerto Rico, in an island that is really 35 miles by 100 with a population of over 4 million people. We opened Hacienda Buena Vista, which was down in the south near Ponce, in 1986 as an educational and environmental center, to much acclaim to the world of historic preservation and many, many Puerto Rican families. Following that time, I continued to work with the Conservation Trust to develop 3 other nature reserves around the island, and with those reserves, visitor centers. Around 2001, we started planning for the Conservation Trust's largest site, Hacienda Buena Vista. Hacienda Buena Vista is about an hour west of San Juan on the north coast. Arriving at La Esperanza, we found ourselves again face to face with the legacy of slavery. The plantation was, for a time, the involuntary home to one of Puerto Rico's largest populations of enslaved people, about 152 at its height. The plantation was also one of the most technologically advanced, and there remains the chimneys and the Gothic-style steam-powered sugar mill still loom over the landscape. The rest of the 2,300-acre site, any evidence of a plantation are pretty much obliterated by years of cattle farming. But the legacy of sugar trade and the human power it required are still undeniable. At La Esperanza, more than just the physical evidence pushed us to delve into the subject of slavery. A generation of scholarship had emerged since the meeting at Buena Vista, and a younger group of thinkers, many from UPR, University of Puerto Rico, had joined our team. They energetically pursued the topic of slavery as central to the contemporary experience of this place. In 2005, we held a scholar symposium on the public presentation of slavery at La Esperanza. One participant suggested that the stories of the slaves should be the primary narrative at this site, overshadowing the site's significant pre-Columbian cultures and its rare, and as you can see in this image, amazing biodiversity. Our approach at La Esperanza was multidisciplinary from the beginning. We created 2 teams, one of scientists and one of historians. An archaeologist was assigned to cover both teams. And eventually we added a 3rd team, a team of oral historians, to interview the surrounding residents and to involve those residents in the process of creating this new property for the Conservation Trust. We were looking at the La Esperanza as a place over time and planned exhibitions covering over 1,500 years of natural and human history. One of the more important exhibitions we planned for the visitor center was investigating La Esperanza, uncovering the past. We decided, this is a rendering of one of the early exhibit ideas, we decided against representing a single view of how the site was used by its most prominent inhabitants, the Tainos and Ostiones, and then in the 19th century as a sugar hacienda. Instead, we would try to answer the question, how do we know what happened here? We wanted the visitors to engage in the same research process and discovery process as we, the curators and experts, were going through. When we were exploring the themes of slavery at Hacienda Buena Vista and Ponce, we had plenty of documents. There was evidence of slaves as property, ownership papers, census tallies, and records of death from a cholera outbreak, drawings and even maps of Rosa's garden. At La Esperanza, we had many of the same records, but we were looking at them as more than documents. We were reading them to discover the stories of the people involved. For example, we looked at an official map of the hacienda that was created in 1872. It's this map. Here we see the arrangement of the cane fields, we see boundaries, and we see the very small amongst the, well, you can't, at this scale, you can't see the historic center. But we took the historic center, Don Jose Ramon Fernandez, who was at the time a leading conservative and anti-abolitionist, and we asked the archaeologists to take that map and go out and see how true the map was before we made any other decisions. He, of course, found that many of the buildings that were on the map, in one of the buildings there was no evidence, or in one case, one of the buildings was found in the middle of an pre-existing road. So it's very possible that this same Fernandez, who in fact bought himself the title of the Marqués de la Esperanza, could have been creating a map. This is a few years prior to emancipation. He could have been looking for investors and kind of increasing the value of what he really had. In looking at the hacienda operations also, we find many threads of personal stories. Production records can be used to extrapolate man hours, and from them each person's ponderous daily and seasonal workload. This is just an illustration, not from the site, please. However, these records and the archaeological evidence also indicate levels of specialization in the labor force at the hacienda. We know, for example, that the qualified tasks would have been entrusted to the oldest slaves. Many of these were likely to be African-born. Some of the names we know are Andres, the master azucarero, who at 66 had originally been brought to Puerto Rico at a very young age by the Marques's father, and who had been trained to perform the vital task of deciding when the sugar was finished in the long process of boiling. Others are Fabio, the maquinista, or mechanic, who was 52, Ambrosio, the blacksmith, who was 34 in 1870, and Isidoro, the 22-year-old carpenter, who was the son of Felipa, a domestic slave in the Casa Blanca. There was also specialization in the cane fields as well. We were given a collection of machetes, and what's interesting about the collection is each machete had a different name and a different function. Therefore, it required a different skill in the fields. One of the most interesting sources, I'll back up, was first-person narratives that we uncovered in court testimonials between the years of 1868 and 1873. Some 47 enslaved persons went to the local judge with the help in those days of the abolitionists to air grievances about severe punishments or benefits being withheld. These transcripts helped us understand that slaves in Puerto Rico had certain rights and that they were aware of their rights to certain kinds of food, clothing, recreation, including music. One of the testimonials was given by a woman named Reyes, a domestic servant, who argued to the judge that she was 60, and therefore, since the Mole law, she should be allowed to go free, because the law said that it meant that it would emancipate slaves over 60 and newborns. And that was in 1870. The Hacienda's Major Duomo was there at the testimonial. He counted that she was only 49. She lost. But historians reading the records suggest that she may have been the same Maria de los Reyes who gave birth to a baby named Maria Candelaria in 1862. In a fascinating connection, Maria Candelaria is remembered by residents of the communities surrounding La Carranza as a legendary and profoundly sad figure named Cayaya, who never smiled. And in one of a dozen of our oral histories given to the research team, one resident said of Cayaya, "She was always with us and always told us stories. Many of her stories were about slavery." We launched one of the first oral history projects in Puerto Rico. A third-person team spent a season at La Esperanza interviewing about 60 local residents, such as Doña Fanny Ortiz and Don Pedro Escobar. Although few made a direct connection of lineage to slavery, several suggested that they do see themselves as tied to the property in ways that are not dissimilar. The cane cutter did, as Pedro, did and after all perform the same work as the slave, in the same place, in the same seasons, with the same tools. From their oral histories, we know that the cane cutters of La Esperanza, as immortalized, of course, in the photos of Jacques Delano and in the work of Sidney Vince in the southern part of Puerto Rico, see their lives as a form of slavery as well. These are some of the Delano photos. As I mentioned last May, we held in San Juan a symposium of some of the most active scholars in the field of Caribbean slavery, focused on Puerto Rico. Papers delivered covered topics including slave families and former religious practices, that was Fernando Pico, slave diet, empire, slavery, abolition, and slavery and its aftermath, memory today. Together, scholars, interpreters explored possible directions for creating an interpretive framework dedicated to slavery in Sugar and La Esperanza. Our consensus was that the exhibition should begin in Africa and should put Puerto Rican slavery in the larger institutional and economic context. Again, we don't have time for that whole history of the world part 2. The visitor experience, we agreed, should challenge existing concepts and be deeply personal for the visitors. This is important. Engaging all 5 senses in using the entire historic core area, not just the exhibition gallery. One participant said, "Let them sweat outside. Get them out. After all, this is not an exhibition in downtown." Our interpretive ideas included replanting some of the cane fields so that you could understand the scale of the cane, the hardship of the environment, and eventually during the safra, or the harvest season, we would be able to burn the bagasse, which is the remains of having pressed the cane. And so when you would arrive at the site, there would be that very acrid aroma, so you wouldn't be able to forget where you were. We also talked about planting the conucos, which were the gardens that could have been used for the consumption of the families as well as sold at the Saturday markets. We talked about creating a wall with probably 70 machetes and their sharpening stones, which would have been collected at the end of every day. We talked about dramatizations of those amazing testimonials, and we talked about an archaeological dig, the image on your right, creating an active archaeological dig, because that is we're supposing that this is the outdoor kitchen that would have been next to the proposed slaves' quarters. We're still investigating. This is a work in progress, and that's what makes it so interesting. From the papers and the informal roundtables, the participants at the symposium were able to come up with a portrait of a slave in Puerto Rico that revealed all of the complexity and depth of the slave situation as we had come to understand it. To summarize, we said that a slave was resourceful, had savings, had rights to food and clothing, could enjoy religious sacraments, was a heathen, could practice African culture, could garden, had some physical mobility, had limited societal mobility, had some means of resistance, was considered valuable property, was indispensable to the production of sugar, had free time, was under constant vigilance, could be whipped to death, torn apart by dogs, had access to municipal courts, could be considered more valuable than free and paid laborers in the plantation hierarchy. In the end of these very difficult sessions, one of the Conservation Trust staff said, "Until this meeting, I really never thought about my enslaved ancestry." Later, another concept for an exhibition emerged. We have yet to see which kind of presentation packs the most interpretive power. This idea was to present a single object in a gallery. This object, El Padrón General de Esclavos, from 1870. It's the slave ledger from Hacienda La Esperanza that lists in cold detail a kind of portrait in words of each enslaved person, their color, height, hair, beard, eyes, nose, mouth, along with place of birth. Reading the names and stark information in the public ledger can raise provocative questions that could reveal intimate aspects of slave lives and the hacienda. Finally, seeing this ledger was made only 3 years prior to abolition. Visitors might wonder what became of people documented in these pages. Ultimately, some might ask themselves, is it you? Is it me? If an exhibition at La Esperanza is to be successful, visitors will understand that the slaves of La Esperanza did not vanish in history, but continued to make choices and set upon those actions, possibly in a limited way, but that their choices and actions, like those made of all the plantation owners and politicians, continue to shape Puerto Rico in some way. Thank you.